So as I said, it's my job. Sorry, is that too loud? Sorry. I'm looking at Don because that's good. Okay. It's my job to offer a little bit of a response here to what we have just heard and set up the discussion for later on. And my response could be, wow, and thank you. Yeah. One of the things that we were talking about, Robert and Barbara and I had lunch together before this, and one of the things that we were talking about was Robert's work on Dr. Fulton, and how what we can't do is ask Dr. Fulton questions, but as Barbara pointed out, she looks at these surgeons and can take little bits from each person's story and answer those questions that we may have for people like Dr. Fulton. And then that presents a much richer and fuller picture of their experience. So that's sort of one of the takeaways that I'm getting from sitting here and listening to these excellent presentations. But I want to kind of use today as a jumping off point for thinking differently about Civil War medicine. As we've seen already, there is a much deeper story than just sort of what we've been conditioned to hear. And I want to start with kind of my own experience in thinking differently about Civil War medicine and two stories that, to me, summarize a different way that we can begin to think about medicine. And I want to start by talking about a surgeon named Abner Hard of the 8th Illinois Cavalry. And Barbara's in here shaking her head, so she knows she knows who I'm talking about. So Abner Hard, it's the Battle of Upperville, June 21st, 1863. So it's about 10 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. And Buford's command is fighting a battle near Ashby's Gap. And Abner Hard, as the division surgeon, is tasked with setting up a division-level field hospital and treating wounded soldiers. He's 40 years old, graduate of Rush Medical College in Chicago, and he's going to perform this duty within the confines of the Letterman Plan, which had gone into effect the year before, the fall before. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Letterman Plan, it's a series of reforms that Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, has put into effect. Resources, human and material, are going to be at the division level rather than the regimental level. We're going to have an ambulance corps. We're going to have litter bearers under the command of the medical department rather than the quartermaster department. And maybe the most important, the three most knowledgeable and skilled surgeons are going to be the operators. So 5 years later, 1868, Abner Hard is reflecting on his experience in the mountains of Virginia that night. He says, "One man, I. Pickett, of Company F, had been shot in the thigh, severing the femoral artery, and before he could be brought from the field, nearly bled to death. A tourniquet was applied, and he was left to rally by the use of stimulants while others were undergoing operations. When the order came to move, our attention was turned to him. We thought this desperate situation justified desperate proceedings, and we successfully and operated successfully and tied the artery." And in a single passage, Hard illustrates how prompt care, provided by the right people at the right time with the right resources, saved this man's life. And a year earlier, this framework would not exist. So fast forward to 2013. I'm a graduate student at Shippensburg University. I'm sitting in the graduate office, and we hear about the Boston Marathon bombing. And a year later, I'm here, and I'm starting to construct the education program here at Seminary Ridge Museum. Thank you, Barbara. And I come across Hard's account, and I think, wow, that's different than what I've heard. That's much more advanced. And around the same time, I come across the FEMA report on the Boston Marathon bombing. And I'm going to read a portion of that report. "A major life-saving factor after the incident was the short time span between when the blasts occurred and when victims received medical attention. For victims who sustained severe injuries, receiving rapid medical triage and care immediately after the blasts dramatically increased their chances of survival. Quickly applying tourniquets in the field and en route to trauma centers played a large role in patient survival. According to Joseph Blansfield, trauma program manager at Boston Medical Center, the result of applying tourniquets was that bleeding was able to be staunched, and as a result, people arrived in better physiologic states and didn't require as much resuscitation as they otherwise would have. So, truth is, as we can see from these two similar passages, that Civil War medical advances show up in the present in ways we might not even consider. Before the war, the military consisted of 16,000 men, and there was little thought given to a mass casualty situation, what response to a mass casualty situation would look like. Hospitals at the time, in the 1860s, are primarily for the poor and the mentally ill. One could easily become a doctor without ever having worked on a human body or being licensed by a state. And then within 4 years, these aspects of American life are going to change dramatically, born out of this crucible that we call the Civil War. But, unfortunately, over the last 150 years or so, we've been conditioned to believe that this was a disaster. Again and again you hear the common refrain, oh, doctors were butchers. Why couldn't they figure out how to clean their tools? And my personal favorite, you were awake during surgery. And I was going to show a clip from Gone with the Wind, but I decided against that. But mostly everybody knows what I'm talking about. We don't need to take time with that clip. A few years back, I'm doing a program for kids on surgery. I do a medical program here where we put a kid on a door and show you how you take an arm off. And I'm in the middle of this program describing this intricate way that a professional surgeon is going to remove an arm. And I have a parent who's standing behind me and says, well, why wouldn't they just take an axe and chop it off? Why wouldn't they take an axe and chop it off? And I'm in the middle of a program, so I'm focused on what I'm doing. And afterwards I say, what was that to myself? And my response should have been, would a doctor be doing that today? These were trained professionals, but we still hear this refrain. I mean, this was within the last 3 years that they were butchers. So why do we think this way? I've been really concerned with trying to figure out, where does this narrative, this false narrative, come from? And we just sat here and we heard for the last hour or so about how advanced these guys, these surgeons, and I'm going to say guys because they were guys, we know how learned they were and how well trained they were. And so how does this narrative come to play? Of course, there's the scene from Gone with the Wind. Hollywood, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Empty Sleeves, and in it, the author, Brian Craig Miller, says that amputation scenes are easier to come by at the cinema. Indeed, in Hollywood war movies, a dismemberment scene is de rigueur. And Gone with the Wind, I think, and without having any solid evidence, but I continue to maintain that scene at least accounts for the myth that surgeries were done without the use of anesthetic. And while Dr. Meade's situation was special and he may not have had anesthesia, 95% of surgeries done during the Civil War were done under ether or chloroform. Second thing that contributes to this false narrative is the widespread advancements that you see in medicine by the end of the 19th century. So by 1867, Joseph Lister is beginning to publish his treatise on antiseptic practices. Louis Pasteur is finding out what role germs play in disease. Quinine is discovered as a treatment for malaria. Doctors are starting to specialize in cardiology, neurology, plastic surgery. So all of these contributing factors that were killing people during the Civil War, by the end of the 19th century, are that we have treatments for. So that's a contributing factor. And Robert, in his book, talks about these ahistorical comparisons that we tend to make. And one of the things that he cites is the words of the doctors themselves. So some of these surgeons, after the Civil War, get really down on themselves for what they didn't know. And one of my favorite doctors, because he writes so much, is a man named W.W. Keene. And in 1905, he's writing his surgical reminiscences of the Civil War. And he's a young medical student in 1861, July of 1861. He shows up in Washington, D.C. right before the Battle of Bull Run. He presents himself to the medical authorities. They don't ask him for his credentials. And he spends the 2 weeks between the time he shows up in Washington, D.C. and the Battle of Bull Run familiarizing himself with military surgery. And that's his exact words. So that's who you want to see when you look up from the operating table, is somebody who has familiarized himself in military surgery over 2 weeks. The first Battle of Bull Run, he describes, quote, was like the days where there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. I was as green as the grass around me as to my duties on the field. 1861. And as the war progresses, as we've seen, he becomes more adept, he and his companions become much more adept at providing medical care, but he continues to criticize himself in 1905 for what he did not know. And he says, quote, what we did not have in those days was almost more noticeable than what we did have. We had no antiseptics, for antisepsis was as of yet even undreamed of. Infection was, quote, fully expected and looked upon as unavoidable. He describes the, quote, dreadful mortality of military surgery in the days before antisepsis and first aid packages. At the end, he happily concludes, such death rates can never again be seen, at least in civilized warfare. So here's a man who was there, and he talks about how bad it was. So why is it important that we change the way that we think about Civil War medicine? Why are we here? Why are we engaged in this exercise this afternoon? Well, I keep going back to this quote from a historian named Richard Shyrock in 1962, and he wrote, if medical aspects are omitted from a study of the Civil War, the story is not only incomplete, but is unrealistic as a total picture. I maintain that a full and nuanced study of history can help us understand our present and inform our future. That's something that Darrell and I keep saying about the uses of history. We were at a point where scholars have shown the crucial role of medical care in the Civil War and how it affects our life every day and can even inform our responses to conflict as well as natural and man-made disasters currently. Started off by talking about the response to the Boston Marathon bombing. But aspects of the Letterman Plan are still used by the United States Army today. I was just reading a handbook of responses to mass casualty situations in the Army, and it looks eerily like the Letterman Plan. Recently, I spent a day and a half in Washington, D.C. and Gettysburg with representatives from USAID, a government agency that deals with responses to disasters around the world. And we were looking at how the responses to the humanitarian crisis of the Civil War can be used to help people conceive of responses to food crises and infrastructure rebuilding around the world in places like the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. Another thing, through the lens of the Civil War, we can see the benefits of government-supported scientific medical research and the widespread sharing of information. That's a big thing that comes out of the Civil War. And then we can also see, as Barbara talked a little bit about the opioid crisis, there are some eerily similar parallels between the opioid crisis of the 19th century and what's plaguing our communities today. Furthermore, recognizing medical personnel as professionals, not just these indiscriminate butchers, but thoughtful and methodological in their approach to warfare in the human body, can help provide a deeper understanding, I believe, to the costs of war. Many of these men work tirelessly and at grave danger to themselves, both physically and emotionally, attempting to save soldiers' lives. Yet we can't escape the fact that over 700,000 people lost their lives as a result of the Civil War, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of others go home with broken bodies, mentally broken. Brian Craig Miller, again, Empty Sleeves, draws a connection between the Civil War and the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Amputated veterans, this is a quote from him, amputated veterans who served in combat are all around us, and yet we rarely see stories about the damaged bodies of war. It is part of our selective memory about the dark side of our military engagements. Video footage and still photographs of soldiers usually reveal combat scenes or joyous returns, not the bloodied stumps, charred flesh, and reconstructed bodies trying to cope with their new reality. Recently, a visitor to Seminary Ridge Museum left a Facebook comment reflecting on his visit. It's my favorite quote describing a feedback on the museum. After more than a week of visiting historical sites as well as the battlegrounds of the American Revolution and the Civil War, the visitor writes, it finally got to me. The Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg does an incredible job of telling the personal side of the horrors of war. This seminary was transformed overnight from a seminary to a military hospital. They told of the things which we really did not want to hear, but the things which we needed to hear. So very sad. Finally, I'm going to end on a high note, a little bit of a high note. Finally, a deeper view can help us to hope. At the beginning of programs on medicine and the Civil War, I invite all participants, young and old, to consider what medical professionals did with the knowledge that they possessed at the time, rather than faulting them for their lack of knowledge on topics like germ theory. By asking this question and seeing how historical actors during the Civil War answered, what did we do with what we knew? I think that it can help us, 150 years later, think about what we are doing with the knowledge that we possess today. Thank you.